Hello, and welcome to another lesson from Level Up Mathematics. In today's lesson, we will be estimating percents mentally. Now, before we do, we need to review some common percent fraction equivalents. So when we find a percent of a total, then we are finding a fraction of it. Identify the equivalent fraction for each percentage. Now, most of these you should have memorized. Hopefully you do, so we'll just go through these very quickly. What is the equivalent fraction for 50%? Hopefully you remember that is 1/2. 25%, 1/4. 10%, 1/10. 1%, 1/100. 20%, 1/5. So 60%, if 20% is 1/5, 60% would be 3/5. 12.5%, now a lot of people don't have this memorized, but it is an important one. 12.5% is 1/8. 75% is 3/4. Now we're going to use some of these common fractions to solve the next set of problems. Solve each of the following by multiplying the total by the fraction equivalent for each percentage. So find 25% of 44. There's two ways you could do this. You could multiply 0.25 times 44, which that's a very long process because you're multiplying a two-digit by a two-digit. A quicker way is to multiply the fraction equivalent for 25%, which is 1/4 times 44. And then we can cross cancel. 4 will go into 44 11 times. So 1 times 11 is 11. So 25% of 44 is equal to 11. All right, find 10% of 3,200. Well, 10% is 1/10. And if I multiply that by 3,200, 3,200 divided by 10 is 320. So 10% of 3,200 is 320. Find 20% of 45. Now our fraction equivalent for 20% is 1/5. So we're going to multiply 1/5 of 45, which is the same thing as 45 divided by 5, which is 9. So 20% of 45 is 9. Now again, keep in mind, this is a much faster way than multiplying 45 times 0.20, which is going to take you a lot of time. So knowing your fraction equivalents to percents can save you a ton of time on problems. All right, find 12.5% of 40. Now, if you were doing this a long way, you would have to multiply 12.5 times 40. That's a 3-digit times a 2-digit, which is going to take a lot of time. But if you know 12.5% is the same thing as 1/8 times 40, 40 divided by 8 is 5. All right, 75% of 40. Pause the video and try this problem on your own. When you're ready to check your answer, press play. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you remembered that the fraction equivalent for 75% is 3/4. So 4 will go into 40 10 times, and we're left with 3 times 10, which is 30. So 75% of 40 is 30. All right, 40%. Now, we knew 20% was 1/5, so 40% must be 2/5 of 35. Pause the video and try this problem on your own. When you're ready to check your answer, press play. All right, welcome back. 5 goes into 35 7 times, and 2 times 7 is 14. So 40% of 35 is 14. Now, that's one way that we can make multiplying a percent by the whole a much faster process when we know the fraction equivalents. Another way that we can estimate percents mentally is by knowing how to calculate 10% of something. So let's look at example 3. If Quinn has $250 and spends 10% of it on fast food, how much money does she have left? So 10% of 250 is the same thing as 1/10 times 250. And 250 divided by 10 is simply 25. So all you're doing here to find 10% of a number is you're just moving the decimal to the left one place. So 10% of 250 is $25. So the question doesn't say how much did she spend. It says how much money did she have left over. So if she had $250 and then she spent 10% of that, which was 25, how much would she have left over? So $250 minus $25 is $225. That's what she'd have left over. Part B. There are 450 students at a high school. If the school expects 10% more students next year, how many total students would they expect? So 10% of 450, remember you just move your decimal in to the left one time, would simply be 45. So that means they're going to have 45 more students next year. So we're going to take the number they had this year and we're going to add the 45 to it. So 0 plus 5, 5 plus 4 is 9. So next year, they will have a total of 495 students. This 10% shortcut is very powerful. Let's look at another example. Hannah and her friend spend $60 at a restaurant and would like to leave a tip. We're 20% of the $60 total. How much should they leave for a tip? Now, in this problem, we're trying to calculate 20% of $60, but we're going to get 10% first. So 10% of $60 would be $6. We're just moving our decimal in one place. So 20% of 60, if 10% of 60 is 6, then 20% would be double that. So 20% would be $12. So how much should they leave for the tip if they want to leave 20%? $12. Okay. Levi spends 40% of his monthly pay on rent. If he earns $3,200 per month, how much is his rent? So we're going to use 10% to calculate 40%. So 10% of 3,200 would be 320. So 40%, all we would have to do is multiply that 10% by 4. So 320 times 4. That would be $1,280. That's how much his rent is. So we're using the 10% to get the 40%. All right. Use the 10% shortcut to scale down to answer the following questions. Nicole wants to buy a jacket that has a regular price of $84. If it's on sale for 5% off the listed price, how much will the discount be? So again, I'm not going to calculate 5% right off the bat. I'm going to get 10% first. 10% of $84 would equal $8.40. So if I wanted 5%, I know 5% is half of 10%. So half of $8 would be $4, and half of 40 cents would be 20 cents. So 5% of $84 is $4.20. Again, just like in the previous examples, I'm using 10% to get the 5%. All right, we can even use the 10% trick to get things like 9%. B, Ariel purchased a new pair of headphones for $210. The sales tax in her city is 9%. How much would the tax be? So 10% of $210 would be $21. So I know 9% is going to be pretty close to $21. Let's calculate 1%. To calculate 1%, just divide 21 by 10. So that would be $2.10. So to get 9%, I'm just going to subtract the $21 minus the $2.10. So let me add a couple placeholders here. This would be 0. 10 minus 1 is 9. 20 minus is $18.90. So 9% would be $18.90. All right. Problem 6. Use the 10% shortcut to scale up or down in order to answer the questions below. A new skateboard has a regular price of $250, but it's on sale for 15% off. What will the price of the skateboard be after the discount? So let's start by getting 10% of $250. And that would simply be $25. So 5% of $250 would be half of $25, which would be $12.50. Now that I know 10% and 5%, I can get 15% by adding those two together. So that would be $37.50. So that's her discount. But the question didn't ask for how much is the discount. It said what will be the price after the discount. So we need to take our $250 and subtract off the discount. So 0 minus 0, this would be 10 minus 5, this would become 9, 2, 2. So our new price would be $225.50. All right. Miss Jones wants to give her pet sitter a 25% tip for watching her dog for a week. If the pet sitter charges $150 for the week, how much should Mrs. Jones give the pet sitter to cover the fee plus the tip? So let's calculate 10% of $150 first. That would be $15. So 20% would be double that. 20% would be $30. 5%, I would take half of the 15, which would be $7.50. So 25%, I would add the $30, that's the 20%, plus the $7.50, which is the 5%. So that would be $37.50. So how much should Ms. Jones give to her pet sitter? Well, she owes her the $150 for her fee, plus the tip, which is $37.50. So 7, 5 plus 3 is 8. So she should give her $187.50. And that concludes today's lesson, Estimating Percents Mentally.